Welcome to the Young CPA Success Show. If you're a young accounting professional, this podcast is your ultimate guide to navigating your early career. Join us as we share valuable insights, expert advice, and practical tips to help you kickstart your path to success and excel in the accounting industry. Let's embark on this exciting accounting journey together.
Okay, Hannah, so this is an episode that you and I both had circled on our calendar today when we saw it, because we had been excited to do this recording for a while. So our guest today is Madeline Miller. She is I don't really know what to call her, a coach, but she's so much more than a coach, right?
So much more. Yes. And listen to the episode. You'll know exactly why we say that.
Exactly. So here's the question that I want to ask you to kind of set this up and set the scene for the episode. Think back to your first couple of years in industry when you were working. What was an assumption about you that a manager made because you were a millennial?
I think that generally speaking, like because I was young coming in, like I think from a maturity perspective, like there was an expectation that like I needed a lot of like hand holding and babysitting and that I was just this person who was stuck on my phone or, whatever these just cliche things were about our generation coming into the workforce. And it was just so far from the truth. And it was especially hard working with older generations coming into the workforce because of these just unfair like biases against me coming in and who they expected me to be. I have had a lot of good experiences in the workforce, but I've had a lot of bad ones too, a lot of bad managers, and it's not always been a good experience. And Joey, you made a statement in the show that really stood out to me about why people live jobs, and I want you to say it here because I'm going to butcher it if I try to say the statement.
Sure. Yeah. So the comment that I made, and it's cliche, but people, and we have studies to prove this, people don't leave bad jobs. They leave bad managers. They leave bad leaders. And, one of the things that I remember from my early couple of years, was when I was coming into the workforce, there was this perception that millennials were lazy. And that drove me nuts. Because let me tell you, I remember talking to my dad. He didn't have a bunch of extracurriculars that he had to do because college was competitive. My wife started working at 15, millennial, not lazy. And so one of the things that I really want there's a couple of different calls to action in this episode that I want people to pay attention to. If you're a leader in an organization and you found this podcast, I want you to listen to what we were talking about with our responsibility as leaders to create good workspaces and listen to our younger generations. Because let me tell you something, I hated that idea of millennials being lazy. It drove me nuts because I didn't think that I was lazy. And as a leader, I want to not do that same thing. I want to not foster an environment where my Gen Z friends who are coming into the workplace feel like they're being stereotyped or having something happen. The other call to action is for our Gen Z people. I want you to hear that we hear you and we see you, and we're, it's hard not to generalize with generations, and each person is individual and different, but we want you to start living a more fulfilled life at work. And that's why we were so excited to have this conversation with Madeline, because we talked a lot about it. And I know I had some takeaways. I'm sure you had some too that you wanted to get, right into your everyday, start doing these things now. But I just want everybody to hear that, like, we hear you, we see you, and we're going to promise to try to create a space for you. And what I want to hear from you is, hey, we're going to try to fill that space as best we can and be leaders.
I had so many epiphanies during this conversation with Madeline, like literally things that I was like, oh my gosh, I had not thought about that before. Oh my gosh, that's so true. So I hope when you're listening to this, that there's things that you can take away from this, really chew on. I hope that you walk away from this really wrestling as a leader, as somebody who is part of the Gen Z generation, who I hope that you will wrestle with some of the statements and the things that we talk about with Madeline, and can take those and then form your own conclusions and start making a difference today where you're at. So Madeline, tell me just a little bit about your background, like how you got started doing what you're doing and really where your passions are for who you serve.
Sure. So I started out as a lawyer. I was working in Australia, and I sort of jumped around through many different law fields. I sort of had this misconception that by going to law school, it was going to give me my sense of purpose and direction. So that's like a big theme for me, like purpose, direction, like you knowing your values and skills and utilizing them. So I started out as a lawyer, and then I sort of moved around. I worked at the UN. I worked in Cambodia. I worked for government. I worked at a law firm. I did sort of the whole thing. I finally sort of made my way to entertainment law because I'd always been really interested in film and the creative industries, and I'd been at film school. So I sort of thought, well, I'll put the two together. And I ended up working for an Australian agency that supports the film and TV industry, but I really wanted to do something bigger. So in 2015, I moved to the US. I actually moved to study at UCLA. I studied entertainment law, like a master's program. And then I started working in Hollywood, production companies. And I ended up sort of culminating, I guess, my entertainment law experience working for the James Bond franchise. So I was the production attorney on their last film. I worked for them for 6 years, actually. But along the way, I knew that I was never really doing what I truly wanted to be doing. And I wasn't exactly sure what that was. I just sort of knew that this wasn't quite it. And I also knew that I'd never really experienced, after like 15 years in the workplace, what I would consider good leadership. I'd never had a mentor. I'd never really been taught the stuff about work. And I'd always been filled with anxiety about the workplace and sort of it's unwritten rules and customs. And so I had been thinking a lot about like how I was showing up at work and whether I was showing up sort of as the leader I wanted to be. And I really had to like go back and reinvent the wheel and teach myself what that meant. And during that process, I realized that I really cared about this stuff. Like I really cared about work being a happier, more inclusive place for people. And I really understood that a lot of those sort of early years of our work experience, particularly when we're professionals, like we've studied something, we have a vocation, we've landed in that vocation, and suddenly there's all this extra stuff that we sort of have to deal with that no one's taught us. We've been so focused on the technical skills. So I really was driven, I guess, by a passion to help the people that are sort of maybe a couple of years into their career and sort of saying, what's it all about? Is this it? Like, what do I do now? Not necessarily like changing their job or, changing their career, but really like wanting to sort of take that next step up, wanting to get recognized for the work they do, wanting to build out influence, but not really knowing how and not feeling like anyone was there to show them.
I love that.
Yeah. I mean, I feel there are a lot of folks, including a couple in this room right now, who resonate with that whole like trying a bunch of different things, searching, trying to find that one thing and realizing like, oh, it's just not quite it. Like, I think there's a lot of accountants who feel the same way. There's a lot of lawyers who feel the same way. I've heard similar stuff from other, professional type things where it's like, yeah, I thought that I would find fulfillment in the work. And it turns out that's really not where I'm finding the fulfillment. So we end up searching, and that's a challenge. How are you guiding someone like, so let's say like I was your client, for instance, right? And I was saying, hey, I'm feeling a little bit lost in my career. What are some things that you start looking for in that from is there like a common theme that you see of like, oh, it's probably this or probably that? What sort of things do you kind of get into with your clients on that?
Yeah, that's a good question, because that's the sort of thing I asked myself when I sort of wanted to start a coaching platform. Like, what am I going to ask them? Like, what are the common themes that sort of unite us all, right? And I felt like I had a slight insight because I'd worked in so many places and in so many countries. So like I'd sort of been like gathering data along the way. Like, what does everybody want out of work? And I realized that everyone wants to feel like they're doing work that feels meaningful and purposeful for them. Now, that doesn't have to be issues-based work. I think we sort of conflate purpose with saving the planet. And I don't mean to dismiss saving the planet, but, like we kind of like, oh, well, you can't always be doing, good every day. It's not really that. It's like, I want to turn up to work and feel that my best skills are being utilized, that I'm getting recognized and rewarded for those things, and that it gives me a sense of accomplishment at the end of the day, week, whatever. So I really felt like the through line was, I need to feel that there is some purpose to what I'm doing. And then the next thing I really noticed that everybody felt in the workplace was that I just sort of mentioned it, was that they really want to feel recognized for the work they do. They want that they want that interaction with their manager, their boss. They want that feedback loop. They want to know what they could be doing more of. Like, they really want to feel like they've got those strong relationships at work, because that's what buoys us to continue forward. So I think the first two things I look at is like, what do you really want out of work? Like, what really charges your battery, what drains your battery, and how do you want to feel, like, how do you want to be showing up in the workplace? Because a lot of the time I work with my clients, they're like, I'm like this, but I really want to be like this. And, we talk a lot about authenticity, but I mean, what is authenticity? So, I'm not telling people pretend to be somebody else. I'm saying, let's think about what those things are, and let's see where the gap is, like the skills gap, the knowledge gap, the behavior gap, the mindset gap, and let's try and close that gap, because you can turn up like that. But, we got to assess all of your actions, decisions, and behaviors against this North Star and how you're currently being. That was a long answer. I don't know if
there were so many gold mines in what you just said. Like, oh my gosh, like I just had this epiphany, like while you were speaking, just about purpose in general.
And I was like, there was so much there. I probably should have stopped halfway, but
it was so good. It's so good. So like, I want to like dissect that.
I know. I feel so
bit.
passionate about it. Sometimes I'm like, oh, and then I want to add this bit on. So yes.
That's so perfect. Purpose and belief are one of my core like driving factors for me, just personally. And I've been really fortunate here in my role that I get an opportunity to work for organization and with alongside organizations that are doing good in the world. Like, so that is one aspect of what purpose is defined as for me. But what you just said about purpose in terms of in the workplace, that it doesn't always have to look like working along somebody for the good. Purpose can look like showing up as your best self, making someone else feel appreciated, and just helping them understand that, by being here and putting forth and showing up as their best self, they really are working for the greater good. And I think I've been in a position where I'd been like really searching for that in other people to validate that for me up to this point. And realistically, within the past year or so, like my role has shifted to where I've been thinking about this a lot actually this week, is that there are leaders in my organization that like I would follow them to the ends of the earth, because I believe so much in like what they do and what's being built. And I've realized that I'm now in a position where some of that has shifted, that I think there's people looking to Joey and I in our roles for that, like to follow us and for us to create an environment where people want to follow us and want to pour into what we're building. And so we have this unique opportunity shift a little bit. And so it's just taken my mind a bit in terms of to wrap my head around, just in terms of like, I'm on the other side of that now. And that is a great gift that I don't want to take for granted. I feel like I'm like holding this like very fragile piece of glass that I want to be sure that I foster well and don't drop it. And so I guess selfishly, I'm going to ask, like, how would you coach someone through that in terms of just really wanting to respect and foster like that for the care and well-being and people that are looking to us for defining and finding that purpose?
So how would I coach people like you who are sort of in a position where they're suddenly needing to sort of nurture or being looked to nurture that in other people?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think I would start at the same place, because I think and sort of getting back to your question before, like, what do I do? I actually have specific things I start with. So I always start with working out professional values. I do like energy audits on, what makes you feel aligned, what makes you feel unaligned, what sort of substantive work you like to do, what kind of environments you like, what kind of tasks you like, and, also what you don't like. And then one of the things I do, which is, I don't think many coaches would do this, but I look at brand archetypes. So I don't know if you know much about the advertising world, but they have 12 like brand archetypes that are sort of human behaviors, right? They were from like Jung and Plato, but advertisers have taken them and been like, great, like this is going to be our brand identity. So I give these exercises to my clients and I let them play. And I say, if you are a brand, because you are a brand at the end of the day, you're a personal brand. And it's particularly in this world as we promote more and more, So if you're a brand, like, how do you want to be showing up? And like, this is when a lot of the stuff comes up where they go, well, I'm currently like a ruler and I'm like everyman, right? Like, but I actually really also want to be an outlaw. Okay. So then I'm like, all right, well, like, let's see, like, what does that mean? I want to be innovative. I want to be forward thinking. I want to be the one that people go, he's got a great idea. So all of this is to say, like, we do this kind of brand, sort of personal brand work. So I would do that with, like, for example, I would say, okay, you're being looked up to as a person of like influence and people are respecting you and they're coming to you for advice. Have you got the foundations clear? Because it's great that you're so far along in your career, and you are probably an exception because you probably have been more thoughtful about this, but a lot of people in your position haven't, right? They've just landed, and enough years have sort of gone on that they're in this position of leadership. And I would say, all right, so are you really clear on how you want to be? All right, so then what lessons are you now going to be able to impart to the next generation? Because like, what can your last guest I was listening to the other day, he was talking about like using privileges like service, and that's how I see it. Like, I went through things to get here and develop this self-awareness. Like, I now want to be of service in others to help them find that same level of self-awareness. So as a leader, as a mentor, as a coach, as a manager, it's the same thing. Like, how can I develop that level of self-awareness in you so that you develop all the skills for you to shine?
And I think it's, something you mentioned there that has been a bit of a recurring theme for us too with our guests across other things too, conversations we've had with other accountants, conversations I've had with family members, conversations I've had with myself. A lot of times what happens in your career, especially in the first few years, is you move up because of your technical skills, but they ask you to do something different now you're a leader. Well, that's very different than knowing how to do a bank reconciliation or knowing how to write a contract. So
I completely agree.
And if you do feel lost in that, that's normal. Like, that's okay. Like, that's expected in this role. So I'm glad that you're kind of helping people kind of narrow that gap a little bit, because without that perspective of, oh, no, you're not alone. This is normal. And here's some things you can do to solve it. It leads to a lot of, and I'll use myself for this. Like, if you're a very good technical accountant and you feel accomplished every day of like, I did these bank reconciliations and I did them well and I knocked them out and I added value, and now the company asks your value proposition to shift and you no longer feel like you're able to provide the same level of value that you did in your old role, that's a very demoralizing place to be as an employee.
No, everything you've said there 100% resonates with me. It's really similar in law. Excuse me. And actually I would go one step further and say in law, possibly if you're a great technical lawyer, it's like the opposite skills to being a great people person, right? Yeah. So like you could be very, very good at what you do, and it always happens. You come, maybe 3-5 years and they're like, okay, now you're a senior associate or whatever. I mean, that's what we call them in Australia. Now you're managing people. No one's taught you any skills to manage people. No. You're possibly not even interested in managing people, but you just by default, that's where you are, right? And I was like, so who's teaching these people leadership skills? Like, who's teaching them the interpersonal skills they need to manage people? And then the people beneath them are frustrated, demotivated, resentful, check out, like me. Like, I never had great leaders. I never had great mentors. So, my approach is, I consider it a little bit more preventative. Like, I'm getting in now to shape the next generation of leaders and the people that are sort of exactly where you find yourself. Like, suddenly people are looking up to and they're like, okay, I want to do this well. I love like people who are like, I want to develop myself, but I really want to develop myself so I can really positively impact others. Like, to me, that's an ideal client, because like, you've got a level of self-confidence and self-assurance, but you're really curious about what you could be doing now to really take it to the next level. So that's the sort of, anyway, I'll just stop there.
No, I think
all of that's so good.
Yeah, it's great. And I think as we move in, and this is a shift that's happening more in accounting, but I would imagine law is doing something similar as well, where we're moving away from technical skills. 30 years ago when my mom was an accountant, it's like, okay, you have to be able to do technically the skills to do a tax return, for instance. Like, you had to have the math skills because there wasn't software 35, 40 years ago. Now there's software to do a lot of that. So we've seen a shift in a lot of our service industries that we work with and work in to start moving more into that advisory additional layer of value that you can add. So somebody being introspective and saying, well, I have self-identified that my value proposition needs to shift to address the needs of the market, I want to encourage that type of behavior from folks, because I think that's great. It's wonderful to be introspective in that way. So I love that you're kind of nurturing that. And I think Gen Z in particular has a lot of that. I work with a lot of students and stuff, in our high schools. And I remember we were doing an exercise at the school and they wanted to get some students involved. And the number one thing that the students said was, we want to start making a positive impact on things today. And I was like, man, when I was 17, I just wanted to play golf. Like, I didn't even care about doing this. Like, I wanted to play golf and I wanted to go to prom. Like, those were the two things I wanted to do. And these kids were like, man, we want to start making a positive impact on our future today.
Yeah.
And
the data shows that, like, that's what's happening with the next generation. They're very purpose driven, and they're also demanding things of their managers that we were too scared to ask. Like, one of the things in a Deloitte survey showed that the biggest thing they wanted from their managers was empathy. Now, I probably wanted empathy, but I was never thinking when I was in my 20s, like, I just wish my manager showed me more empathy. Like, I wasn't thinking like that. I was just like, oh, I'm scared, I'm nervous, he's horrible, blah, blah, blah. Like, they're demanding things of people that I think they get a bad rap because people are like, they're so purpose driven, they're so demanding, they're so entitled, they don't have a reality perspective, all of that stuff. But I'm like, are they actually asking for anything that we probably didn't want ourselves? They just got the language for it, right? They just feel entitled to ask for it. Now, I'm not saying there aren't challenges with the generations at work, and I do a lot of this stuff with companies and talk about this a lot because I do think there's very real intergenerational challenges, but I always try and reframe it as like coming from a position of curiosity. Like, what do they really want? What's the underlying need here? Rather than what are they saying or doing? Yeah.
Those intergenerational challenges, we are feeling them very painfully in our industry. Like, there was an article I read that Gen Z, like, they don't want to become accountants. Like, that,
really?
the article was like one of the world's careers is like going to become extinct because Gen Z doesn't understand how they could find purpose in our field, in our industry. But I think what you're saying to me is that we have a really huge opportunity as leaders, at middle level management, all of this, to reshape how we are positioning purpose in our industry. Not just in like, hey, let me go yell it from the rooftops, but no, like, how am I tangibly actioning that on a daily basis? So that way, as people do come into this industry, they walk away and tell their friends, man, I love my job. I feel so fulfilled. I feel so good about my decision to be here. So that way, then just the perspective and idea around who we are and what we do just changes. Because like you said, Joey, like, we are shifting away from the technical side of the things that we do. So before, whenever you could come into this because you're like, man, like, I love math, I love accounting, I love the technical, I can balance a journal entry, like, I can do a bank reconciliation, like, that feels good, I can shine in that way. And it's not that you can't, it's just that has changed in terms of just what you need to be able to show up with. But I think that communicating that to Gen Z is so incredibly important for us specifically, because they are looking for that purpose. And there is a huge opportunity to be able to have that fulfillment in this career, especially now that it's shifted the way that it is. But I don't know that we as leadership are doing as good of a job as we could be doing just in the day-to-day of making sure that's communicated to the people in our care.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's so much stuff that you said there that I was like, I want to say something about that. So, like, the purpose part, like, it's actually quite simple. If you hear what Gen Z want, or anybody wants, really, they want to be told, they want one-on-ones with their manager. They want to feel like someone's invested in their career. They want somebody that's like giving them professional development, learning and development opportunities. Like, you can do all of that. That's not that hard. So it's really like, as a leader and a manager or, mid-manager, I think sometimes we overcomplicate it. Like, oh, I have to do all these things. Like, no, you just have to show an interest in your staff, acknowledge them when they do well, give them good feedback, learn to give feedback constructively, literally give them some kind of mentorship opportunity, and they will feel purposeful, they'll feel proud, they'll want to show up to work. It's so funny. I love when people tell me they love their job. I love it because, like, it's not actually that common. And when I say, what do you love? They always say, well, they'll say, I like the work. I love my boss, or I love my
Mm.
team.
Mhm.
And that is the stuff that keeps people in jobs.
Mm-hmm.
You could even not like the work, but if you love your team and your manager,
Yeah.
you will be happy at work.
That's
They
so true.
always say it. Yeah.
I heard, I can't remember, it's cliche, but it's true. Like, people don't leave bad jobs, they leave bad managers
Yeah. Yeah.
and bad bosses. That's
100%.
100% true.
Yeah. And when you do leave a job that you've got a good manager or boss like you, it's so different. Like the
Hurts.
feeling is so different. You're like, I'm so sorry. I've done it before. I'm just, it's not you, it's me. Like, really, it's just, I can't, and it's such a different relationship. And it's such a nicer relationship because we often have so many traumas from work, really. I mean, people have so many traumatic experiences
Mhm.
maybe I'm using that term a bit lightly, but they have a lot of experiences from work that have marked them in some way. Like a lot of them, I work with them and they're carrying through a bad experience with a boss or a bad experience with a partner or coworker from decades ago, right? And it's still impacting their confidence at work. So, I think we sort of compartmentalize work relationships as just this thing that happens that you don't need to invest in like other relationships. We're very happy talking about family relationships, romantic, even friendships. But at work, it's just like, well, it's just work. It's like they are also very important relationships that you spend most of your life in because you're at work more than anywhere else. Why are we not looking at those sort of interpersonal skills in the same way that we are in these other areas? It sort of blows my mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm thinking about it too. The work isn't always going to be fun. The work isn't always going to be good. Like, we're in a career, obviously, we're known for really long hours, really grueling work sometimes. That some of that just hasn't changed, even though we have seen a shift in our industry. Some of that, in terms of the actual work that we're doing, has not changed. And so I think for me, like, that really shifts the emphasis and importance on the interpersonal side of what we do. Because in order to get people to stay, in order to get people to show up, in order to get people to make the statement that I love my job, it's got to come from the interpersonal side of what we do and the opportunities that we have, because it's not always going to come from the actual work that we do.
Right.
Like, it's just not.
Right. And that, the interpersonal stuff too is funny. It's a big part of this program that I'm developing specifically for Gen Z and millennials. So I want to try and have a fully digitized program where they can access it, and it's self-paced. And one of the things I talk about, which I think is also a bit of a misconception, is that conflict is inevitable. Even if you have a great relationship with your boss or your team, if you are with a bunch of people, you're going to have different opinions, you're going to have different needs, right? So who is teaching you how to manage conflict effectively? Because I guarantee, well, I don't guarantee, I'd take a bet, I'd hedge a bet that a lot of your leaders are not good at it because they're not taught it, right? I'm getting better at it myself. It's a constant work in process. So if there's this sense that everything has to be happy and we have to be good all the time. No, it's going to be conflict ridden, but it's how your team and your boss manages and deals with conflict that really sets the tone. And that's a happy workplace.
Mm-hmm. And I love that you're developing that for Gen Z, for millennials, because I feel like coming into a workspace, having had at least a baseline of conflict management, of hearing it, it doesn't mean that the first time you go into conflict, you're going to be an expert at it, because Madeline's taught me this in her course. And, I have exposure to conflict. Exactly. Done. I'm good. That's not how it's going to be, but it is going to get easier every single time that you have to face it. It's just going to take some reps, but at least having that foundation for what to expect and just some general baseline skills, I think is going to take and propel someone exponentially into feeling more fulfilled and being able to get past that conflict. Because I know there are times that I've faced conflict that it has been hard for me to mentally get past it, because it just ended up being not great. And
but it rattles you, right? You
does.
Start asking questions about, am I really like this? It's an identity thing at the end of the day, which is why you start with values and identity. You get a really clear sense of who you want to be, how you want to be showing up. You develop the skills to continually show up like that person. And then, like you said, the third part of my program is actually resilience, which is you do it again. You do it again. It's reps, right? You don't just learn it. You've got to go out there in the wild and practice it. So yeah, I love that you said that.
I'm glad you mentioned resilience, because full disclosure, in the background of this, I've got your website up that talks about your acronym, your AIR formula. And I think the resilience thing is so interesting, because I've told people this before. Conflict is a full contact sport. Like
Yeah.
it's rugby. It's not touch football. It is rugby. Like you are
Like,
getting in there full contact. And the resilience thing, I think it's something I admire a lot. I think millennials, we struggle with it a little bit because of the environment that we came into in the workplace. Like I joined the workforce in 2011 and like the recession here was still kind of ending. Like I was just very happy to have a job. And the lack of self-confidence that I had in what I was bringing to the table really held me back in the first 4 or 5 years. I took jobs that I was significantly underpaid for because I was just happy to have a job. I wasn't doing what I needed to do to take care of myself, and therefore I couldn't take care of anybody else in that regard either. One thing I admire a lot about Gen Z, and I'm glad that you're kind of cultivating this and teaching them how to do this in a healthy way, is I admire so much how passionate they are in their own self-identity for a lot of cases. Like, and I think it's important for managers in our position to remind them like, hey, thank you for telling me how you see your value. Thank you for telling me what you care about and what your why is. And it's our job to help cultivate that, not say we need to get you and throw all that aside and get you aligned with me. It's the other way around. We need to align ourselves with you.
Wow. I mean, yes, I agree, but that's not a sentiment you hear very often. Like, if you work with companies like I do with the big generations, it's always like they're going to come to the party. Like the people up here, like you got to come to the party, young ones. Like they're not. And I'm always like, it's not about positioning one as right or wrong. It's literally about, as I said, like generating that level of curiosity about what might be going on. Like, what are they really asking for? So I always look at it like you sort of try and identify your own self-belief. Like, what is my belief? Like Gen Z are entitled, just say, right? And then it's like, okay, so that's my fixed belief. And if I sit with that belief, it's just going to remain as, right, the status quo. What if I try and take a more curious, mindset, like, and sort of reframe that, like, what could I then ask? So then, we might play around with it. We'd be like, okay, a more curious mindset might be, so Gen Z lack professionalism. Okay. Or sorry, I said Gen Z are entitled. Okay. So let's look at the context at which Gen Z entered the workforce and see whether that might have something to do with how they're feeling. Like what opportunities are they getting in their early career that or what are they not getting in their early career that I got? So one of the big things, for example, is that they finished school in a pandemic online. They potentially started work online. Like they didn't have that interpersonal in-office experience like we all did when we first started out. So they didn't have the opportunity to like knock on the door of the boss like I did when I was feeling anxious or seek feedback. So, they haven't been given the chance to develop some of those skills. So yeah, they're entitled. Like they have sort of, they know their rights and their interests and their needs, but they're also really vulnerable and confused. And so, if I'm taking a more curious mindset, I might be like, okay, let me just try a different behavior, which might be like ask them how they're feeling or, invest in them with some group coaching, whatever it might be, but do something that is going to sort of try and meet them where they are rather than expect them to sort of just rise to whatever standard I've set. Another thing I see too, and I will stop after this because I'm jumping all over the place. Another thing I see with the younger generation is that the older generation are like, well, we did it this way, so you should too. And sometimes I challenge the older generations and I say, how happy were you? How happy are you at work? How good was your work experience? And they always like, well, I didn't like it, but I survived. I'm like, I don't think that should be the benchmark by which we're judging work. Like I got through it. I suffered, so you should suffer.
Well, the thing I love about Gen Z too is there's an independence there, and some of it is we all have these now, which has significantly reduced barriers to being independent, to being entrepreneurial, to being able to, for lack of a better term, manifest your own future. But that's led to a streak of independence that I think a lot of people admire and wish we had, but also really does challenge the entire structure of business. Business is structured to not have independence. It's structured to fit into the hierarchy. And that causes a really interesting conflict there. And it's just fascinating for me to see, like, thinking about from a management perspective, how do I cultivate that series of independence and allow for natural curiosity and those types of, that entrepreneurial mindset? If you're just asking for Gen Z to fit into your own way, I think you're missing a really valuable opportunity to do the opposite thing and said, how do I just get out of this person's way, turn them loose and let them provide the value and figure out how to fit that into my organization? I think there's a mindset shift at management level that has to happen. And this isn't just Gen Z. Same thing happened to millennials in the workforce, right? Like it happens every time there's a new generation.
Yeah. And it's not just like, how can I let them, it is very much like, how can I let them sort of shine, but also like, what can I give them? Like what coaching opportunities can I give them? And like find a creative way to do it. I'm a massive proponent of group coaching because it's more cost effective and also it creates that community that Gen Z and younger workers say they don't have. They can bounce ideas, they feel they're not alone. Like there are ways to nurture your staff early on in, that aren't burning through any learning and development budget. And that's going to like return in dividends, but people don't. They just put it into the too hard basket and leave it there.
You said something that I'm like still chewing on. Like it's been a minute or two since you've said this, but I'm still chewing on the fact that I had really not thought about, especially the generation that's coming into the workforce now, that they pretty much have like ended like their high school careers, like a lot of their college career, like virtually, like not ever being in an opportunity to go knock on somebody's door, like, and feeling that like openness of like feeling like they could, exactly like you said, of like, hey, like, yeah, it took me kind of like taking a deep breath and swallowing real hard before I made the knock, but the door was at least right in front of me and there, and had an opportunity to walk up to it. And this generation in some ways has not had that. So that it really is a mindset shift that I think leadership needs to take into consideration, that we've got to make more of an initiative to go to this generation, to talk to them, to make sure they know they can come to us, but by first initiating that piece of it and spending that time.
We've got to create that infrastructure to allow that to happen.
Yeah, you do. It's we've got to attack it from all angles. Like people in your level need to create that opportunity and experience. I work with younger people to like encourage them to be proactive about it, because I'm always like, you can't, like, assumptions are the worst thing we can do in the workplace. Like never assume, always ask. But assumptions are so much easier to make when you're behind a screen. And if you have it, like you read an email, you can just shut your computer down, walk away. There's not an opportunity for clarification, for discussion, So like when I started out as a lawyer, I was often, in fact, I was anxious every single day. And I sometimes, I would just sort of hover around my boss's door, just because, like, even if he just said hi, I'd be like, okay, he's not furious with me. It was not rational, but like just a small thing like that, I could use it. And like one of the things that was super common back in the day, like we'd go for lunch a lot, not necessarily with your boss, but like with your colleagues, or like it was very common. Like you have an hour for lunch, you pop out of I was working in like the business district, go out for lunch, like that. And then you hear about other people's work and they complain about their boss or what they're doing, so you have that kind of camaraderie that builds. And some of my strongest relationships were work relationships. I don't know if I would have had those if I was all online or even hybrid. It's different. And I'm not saying that like, okay, so then remote work is bad, because I think it serves a lot of very functional purposes, but we have to start accommodating the, like you said, like making opportunities and experiences for the things that they're not getting to experience themselves.
That's so good. My best friend, like it was because we worked together.
Same.
Like we worked together. Like, and it started by like, hey, let's what do you want for lunch? Like, why don't we go like to Mexican?
And we like we bonded over like our like, oh, I hate this law firm, and oh, my boss is this, and then we both went. She went on to become a massive lawyer. She's still a lawyer, even though we complained about being lawyers. But it's exactly the same thing. It was that work relationship. It all started with like, do you want to get a coffee? Do you want to get lunch? Yeah.
Yes. And again, like hadn't thought about that. Like that just like the opportunity for that in today's environment, especially in the environment Joey and I work in, because we are in a mostly
You
distributed
are?
firm. We have some people who work in a hybrid space, but especially in our environment, it's just there's not as many opportunities for that anymore. And like, man, like I just like that friendship for me has just been such like a good point of encouragement. Like we've in some ways like laterally mentored each other through different phases of our life that we've gone through. And like, had I like missed out, like
Mm.
I can't imagine how my life would be like had I missed out on that opportunity to have that friendship.
And
And
even this is just occurring to me now. I actually hadn't thought about this as much, but even like our networks for future are built on those relationships. So like I'm thinking
so
now, like
true.
in those early years, like I got a job because that partner left the law firm but knew me because I never even worked for her, but she knew of me at the work firm. She got me my next job, you know, like, so all of these sort of, yeah, like we're building our career through the networks we make at work. And if we're constantly just behind a laptop in our house, it's so hard. It's really hard.
I mean, I met my wife at the office, and we were
Yeah.
friends for 9 months before we started. Like that would have never happened
Yes.
in any
Like,
other
yeah.
circumstance. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know, so technology has shifted things. Obviously, the pandemic has shifted things. But these are this is the reality. Right? Things have shifted. Like we can lament the shifts, or we can start to come up with creative ways to sort of accommodate them and fill the gaps. And I think by recognizing what the skills and development gaps are.
That's so good. I'm going to give a speech on that actually
I
in November. I'm going to talk to a group of accountants about the skills gap for young accountants coming into the industry. And
Oh,
so this speaks like I'm going to be taking notes for this episode. I'm going to be talking to everybody
I've lots of
about these
resources
things.
I can share with you if you want.
I'd love that.
Yeah.
I would absolutely love that because there is just such a big shift. And as you were talking, I thought about this. I had a boss who I felt I like rolled my eyes at this exercise whenever he made me do it. But he made us come up with essentially our personal vision and our personal mission statement.
I do
And
that.
I was like, why is this guy making me do this? But now, like looking back on that, I'm like, that has been so valuable for me. And it's been an anchoring statement throughout my career that I've been able to circle back to so many times. But also now in my role, I see how valuable that was for him to be able to see what was important to me and what was foundational about why I showed up at work to help me get through the hard days. So I just thinking about that, I feel like there's a huge opportunity there that we need to foster. And I mean, maybe one could argue it could be you could use it a little bit manipulatively, but I think ultimately you can use that for the good in terms of really making sure that we can like find where we can really hone in and plug somebody in the workplace.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because one of the things I do in my kind of alignment modules is exactly that, like a vision statement, a purpose and mission statement, you know, the brand archetype. And because like I said, it's the foundation for who you are. I actually hadn't thought though, like, because I get people to do it individually for them, but actually there is a lot of value in sharing that, you to the extent you're comfortable with a manager, because they like, you know, I'm encouraging managers when I work with managers, I'm encouraging them to get to know their staff more. I mean, that's a wonderful way of knowing your staff more and knowing where they want to go, right? So yeah, the sort of, I hadn't really thought about the two-way value of that.
Yes, absolutely.
Hannah, before we wrap up, I did have one thing I wanted to just kind of shout out from our list of things that because again, Madeline, we could talk for another hour about all the things that
Oh
we
my
could
gosh,
talk
yes.
about.
I know, I
but-
could just keep talking.
Yeah.
Yes.
One thing you mentioned reminds me of a book I read this year that I wanted to make sure I shout out and just kind of throw as a resource out there for people. One of the things we were talking about was how to cultivate leadership opportunities at any level of the organization, and kind of following this idea that it doesn't matter whether you are, and I'll use the hierarchy because there's no better way to do it, the top person or the bottom person on the hierarchy. Every single role has an opportunity to be a leader in that role.
Yeah.
I read a book earlier this year. Yay. Producer Rob's going to roll his eyes and make fun of me about that later. But I read a book by a guy named John Amici. He is an organizational psychologist based out of Britain who was a former NBA player. Oh. And the book is called The Promises of Giants. And it starts with this guy who's, you know, and he played in the NBA. He's legitimately a giant. He's like 6'8", 260 pounds, like a very large man. And the whole premise of the book is he did not realize, because he is himself, he did not realize his impact that he had on other people. And he took this idea and said, it doesn't matter whether you are a literal giant or a figurative giant. Every single person has the opportunity to be a giant for somebody. And with that comes a responsibility of understanding that you are a leader to somebody at any level of the organization. And it really adjusted my mindset of like, to what Hannah was saying earlier, where, hey, there is in our organization, there is a senior accountant, there is an accountant, there is somebody who is looking up to you as a CFO or whatever role you are in your organization. Somebody is looking up to you, and there's a responsibility that comes with that. So I just wanted to validate for all of your audience and our audience that there is a role for leadership training, no matter where you are in the organization, whether it's peer-to-peer or a coach-coachee relationship. Lean into that because it's incredibly important, and, you know, we will notice it and it will be seen in the organization as you move through.
100%. And, you know, empowering your younger staff to start thinking like leaders is like a complete ROI for you as well. Because like if you're like, I talk a lot about like shifting like passive or aggressive thoughts into assertive thoughts, right? And acting assertively. So if you've got people acting assertively, you've got people being proactive, showing initiative, you know, taking responsibility, all the things that you want your staff to be doing. So I completely endorse that position.
Well, Madeline, this has been such a phenomenal conversation. And like Joey said, like, I think we could probably go on talking for the rest of the day on this. Like,
it's already
we're both
15 minutes. Wow, that went so
I know.
quick.
So fast. So fast. So you talked a lot about your resources. So if somebody wants to reach out to you to learn more, to really dive into what you have to offer, what's the best way for them to get in contact with you to do that?
So they can go to my website, which is www.coachingwithmadeline. Should be quite straightforward. And then there's resources there. They can send an inquiry. They can learn more about my programs, and we can connect like that.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. This was a blast.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you're a young CPA looking to develop in their careers, we're always looking for great people. Visit our website for remote work opportunities with Summit Virtual CFO, or find all our open positions at Anders CPAs and Advisors.